The discovery. The mining station on 442B had been silent for 3 days when Captain Sarah received the distress beacon. She stood on the bridge of the UES Vengeance, watching the planet's red surface grow larger through the viewport. Something was wrong, very wrong. "Captain, we're picking up debris in orbit," reported Lieutenant from his station. His voice carried an edge of concern that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "What kind of debris?" "Metal fragments, lots of them, and Captain," paused, his face pale as he studied his readings, "there are bodies floating out there." Sarah felt her blood run cold. The mining station housed over 2,000 colonists, including families with children. She had visited the station just 6 months ago during a routine patrol. She remembered the laughter of kids playing in the recreational areas, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, the pride in the miners' eyes as they showed off their latest excavations. "Take us down to the surface," she ordered, "and prep a full tactical team." The shuttle bay doors opened with a mechanical hiss as Sarah suited up in her combat armor. Around her, 20 of the Federation's best soldiers checked their weapons and equipment. These weren't regular troops. They were the Terran Special Forces, veterans of the wars and the asteroid belt conflicts. Sergeant, a mountain of a man with scars crisscrossing his weathered face, approached Sarah. "Ma'am, preliminary scans show the entire facility has been destroyed. No life signs detected." Sarah nodded grimly. "We go in anyway. Someone needs to tell us what happened here." The shuttle descended through the thin atmosphere, and Sarah got her first clear view of what remained of New Haven Colony. Where once a thriving settlement had stood, now only twisted metal and smoking ruins remained. The main habitat domes had been cracked open like eggs, their contents scattered across the red soil. But it wasn't the destruction that made Sarah's hands clench into fists. It was the precision of it. This wasn't random violence. This was methodical, calculated. Someone had taken their time. The shuttle touched down in what used to be the main plaza. Through the thick of the viewport, Sarah could see bodies scattered everywhere. Men, women, children. Some had been trying to run. Others had been caught while they slept. "Ma'am," called Private Johnson from the communications station, "I'm picking up a weak signal from the administrative building. Someone's alive down there." Sarah was the first one out of the shuttle, her rifle ready. The gravity on 442B was lighter than Earth's, making each step feel bouncy and unnatural. But Sarah had trained in low-G environments since she was 18. She moved with deadly grace across the ruined plaza. The administrative building had suffered less damage than the residential areas. As Sarah's team approached, they could see that the main entrance had been sealed from the inside. Someone had welded the doors shut. "Plasma cutters," Sarah ordered. It took 10 minutes to cut through the reinforced steel. When the doors finally fell inward with a crash, Sarah was met with the acrid smell of smoke and something else, something organic and foul. The lobby was in chaos. Furniture had been overturned to create barricades. Spent ammunition casings littered the floor. Dark stains on the walls told the story of a desperate last stand. "Hello," Sarah called out. "This is Captain of the United Earth Federation. Is anyone alive in here?" A weak voice responded from somewhere deeper in the building. "Here, in the server room." Sarah's team moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, checking each room for threats. They found more bodies along the way. Security guards who had died at their posts, office workers who had tried to hide under their desks. The server room was in the basement, behind 3 layers of security doors. When Sarah finally reached it, she found Doctor huddled behind a bank of computer terminals. The colony's chief administrator was barely recognizable. Her hair was matted with blood, her clothes torn and stained. But her eyes were alert, burning with a fury that Sarah recognized. "Doctor," Sarah said, kneeling beside the woman and offering her a water bottle. "What happened here?" His hands shook as she accepted the water. "They came without warning," she whispered. "Ships we'd never seen before. They didn't try to communicate, didn't make any demands, they just started killing." "Who?" Sarah asked. "Who did this?" "Aliens," replied, her voice growing stronger with anger. "But not like any we'd encountered before. They were methodical, efficient. They rounded up the children first." Sarah's blood ran cold. "The children." Nodded, tears streaming down her face. "They took them to the central plaza, made the parents watch, and then—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah felt something dark and primal stirring in her chest. In her years of military service, she had seen war. She had seen cruelty, but this was different. This was evil in its form. "Did you get a recording of their ships?" Sarah asked. Nodded weakly and gestured toward a portable data drive lying on the floor beside her. "Everything's on there. Ship configurations, tactical data, even some of their communications. They weren't trying to hide. It's like they wanted us to know who did this." Sarah picked up the drive and slipped it into her armor's storage compartment. "We're getting you out of here, Doctor. You're safe now." But even as she said the words, Sarah knew that safety was an illusion. If these aliens could do this to New Haven Colony, they could do it anywhere, to any human settlement, to Earth itself. As Sarah's team escorted back to the shuttle, the doctor grabbed Sarah's arm with surprising strength. "Captain," she whispered urgently, "there's something else." Before they left, their leader broadcast a message on all frequencies, in perfect English. "What did they say?" His eyes were haunted as she repeated the words that would change everything. "Tell your Star Council that the hegemony has come. Tell them that humanity's crimes against the galaxy will not go unpunished. Tell them this is just the beginning." Sarah felt the pieces clicking together in her mind. The Star Council, the galactic government that humanity had been trying to join for the past 50 years. The same organization that had been blocking human expansion, limiting their territory, treating them like unwanted children at the adults' table. "They knew about the council," Sarah murmured. "More than that," replied. "They spoke like humanity was already being tried and condemned, like this was an execution, not an attack." Back on the Vengeance, Sarah stood in her ready room, staring at the data had given her. The alien ships were unlike anything in Earth's databases. Sleek, predatory vessels that seemed to blend organic curves with mechanical precision. Their weapons had torn through New Haven's defenses like they were made of paper. Lieutenant Commander Park, her chief science officer, had been analyzing the communications intercepts for hours. "Captain," he said, entering without knocking, "you need to see this." The holographic display showed a translation matrix of the alien language. Most of it was incomprehensible, but certain phrases had been decoded thanks to the English broadcast had mentioned. "They call themselves the hegemony," Park explained. "And according to these communications, they're acting under the direct authority of something called the Judgment Protocol." "Judgment for what?" "That's where it gets interesting, Captain. The fragments we've decoded suggest that humanity has been accused of war crimes. Not against these hegemony aliens, but against other species. Species we've never even heard of." Sarah stared at the data streaming across the display. "The Star Council," she said quietly. "Ma'am, the Star Council has been stalling our membership application for decades, always finding new excuses, new requirements. What if they weren't just being bureaucratic? What if they were gathering evidence against us?" Park's eyes widened as he understood the implication. "You think the Council has been building a case to justify our extermination?" Sarah was already moving toward her communications console. "Get me Admiral Harrison on priority channel and prep a message drone for Earth. Command needs to know what we're dealing with." As Sarah composed her report, she couldn't shake the image of those children in the plaza. The hegemony had wanted to send a message, and they had chosen the most horrific way possible to send it. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had left a witness, and now that witness had given humanity the warning it needed. The war was coming. Sarah could feel it in her bones. But this time, humanity wouldn't be caught off guard. This time, they would be ready to show the galaxy exactly what species they were dealing with. On the viewport, 442b was shrinking as the Vengeance accelerated toward the outer system. But Sarah wasn't looking at the planet anymore. She was looking at the stars beyond, wondering how many other alien species were watching, waiting for humanity's response. They wouldn't have to wait long. The truth revealed. Admiral Jonathan Harrison stared at the holographic display in the war room beneath Geneva. The images from 442b played on repeat, each loop driving the knife of rage deeper into his chest. Around the circular table, the faces of Earth's most powerful leaders reflected the same mixture of horror and fury. 2,000 civilians, President Martinez said, her voice barely controlled. "Children, Jonathan, they killed children." Harrison nodded grimly. "Captain's report indicates this was planned, coordinated. The hegemony didn't just stumble across our colony, they knew exactly where to hit us." Secretary of Defense leaned forward, his weathered hands clenched on the table. How? Our colonies are supposed to be classified. The only organization with access to those coordinates is. The Star Council, Harrison finished. Yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking. The Chinese representative, General, spoke up from her position at the table. You're suggesting the Star Council gave our enemies the locations of our civilian targets. That's a serious accusation. Is it more serious than the murder of 2,000 innocents? Harrison shot back. For the past hour, Harrison had been briefing the Global Defense Committee on everything they knew about the attack. But he had saved the worst revelation for last. Now, as he activated another section of the holographic display, the room fell silent. This is a communication we intercepted 6 hours ago, Harrison announced. It's from the Star Council to all member species. The translation appeared in glowing text above the table. Priority Communication, Star Council Directive 847 Alpha. To all member species. From Council Prime Archon VLTHROS. Subject, Human Territorial Sanctions. The species designation, Human, has been found guilty of 17 counts of aggressive expansion, 12 counts of ecological destruction, and 43 counts of cultural contamination. Under Galactic Code 12.7, enforcement action has been authorized. The Hegemony Enforcement Division has been contracted to implement containment protocols. Human territorial claims beyond the Sol system are hereby revoked. Any resistance will be met with appropriate force. The Council reminds all species that harboring human refugees or providing aid to human military forces is strictly prohibited under pain of economic sanctions. End communication. The silence that followed was deafening. President Martinez was the first to speak, her voice cold as space. They put out a bounty on us, the entire Star Council. It gets worse, Harrison said, calling up another file. We've been monitoring diplomatic channels since Captain's discovery. 3 more human colonies have gone silent in the past 12 hours. Beta, Wolf 359 and 128. General's face had gone pale. That's nearly 15,000 people. And it's just the beginning, Harrison replied. According to our intelligence networks, hegemony fleets are massing at strategic points throughout our territory. They're not trying to conquer us. They're trying to exterminate us. Secretary stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. We need to contact the Council immediately. There has to be some misunderstanding, some way to resolve this diplomatically. Harrison almost laughed. Diplomatically? Frank, they've already passed our death sentence. There's no court of appeals in their system. But there has to be something, insisted. Some species in the Council who might speak for us. They have always been neutral. The Vegan Confederacy has trade agreements with us. I already tried, Harrison said quietly. I sent diplomatic inquiries to every species we've had positive contact with over the past 50 years. You want to know how many responded? The room waited. 0, not 1. They're all too terrified of Council sanctions to even acknowledge our messages. President Martinez rubbed her temples, fighting off a headache that had been building for hours. What about our allies, the independent systems, the free traders? The independent systems have already declared neutrality, Harrison reported. As for the free traders, they've suspended all contracts with human worlds and are actively avoiding our space lanes. We're completely isolated. The Brazilian representative, Minister Santos, raised his hand. What are our military options? How many ships do we have? Harrison activated another display showing the current disposition of human naval forces. The Earth Defense Fleet has 47 capital ships and supporting vessels. Our colonial defense forces add another 31 ships of various classes, against a hegemony force that intelligence estimates at over 300 vessels. We're outnumbered nearly 4 to 1. Our technology, General asked. Unknown. The attack on New Haven was so one-sided that we don't have good data on their capabilities. But preliminary analysis suggests their weapons and defenses are at least equal to ours, possibly superior. Minister Santos shook his head. Then we're finished, if we can't fight and we can't negotiate. Like hell we're finished, a new voice interrupted from the entrance to the war room. Everyone turned to see Captain Sarah striding through the security checkpoint, still wearing her combat fatigues from the journey back to Earth. Captain, Harrison said, surprised. I wasn't expecting you for another 2 hours. I pushed the engines hard, sir. There are things I need to tell this committee that weren't in my report. President Martinez gestured to an empty chair. Please, Captain, any insights you can provide. Sarah remained standing, her eyes hard as steel. With respect, ma'am, I'm not here to provide insights. I'm here to tell you that everything we've been discussing is irrelevant. The room stirred uncomfortably. Secretary frowned. Captain, I understand you've been through a traumatic experience, but... No, sir, you don't understand, Sarah interrupted. None of you understand. You're all sitting here talking about diplomacy and military options like this is some kind of political dispute. It's not. This is genocide, pure and simple. Harrison leaned forward. Sarah, I know what you saw out there was horrific, but... Admiral, they didn't just kill the colonists on New Haven. They tortured them. Systematically. There were signs of prolonged suffering in every building we examined. They wanted those people to die slowly and in pain. The room fell silent again. Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. I spent 6 hours going through the security footage Doctor managed to save. The hegemony forces didn't just attack military targets first. They deliberately targeted the school, the hospital, the nursery where the youngest children were kept. President Martinez's face had gone ashen. Captain, are you saying this was intentionally designed to maximize civilian casualties? I'm saying it was designed to send a message, ma'am. They wanted us to find the bodies. They wanted us to see what they had done. This wasn't military action. It was psychological warfare. General cleared her throat. The question remains, Captain. What do you suggest we do about it? Sarah's response was immediate and uncompromising. We hit them back. Hard. We show them that humanity doesn't just roll over and die. Secretary looked appalled. Captain, you just told us we're outnumbered and any military response would be suicide. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged. But there's something else I learned from the security footage, something that changes everything. She activated her personal data pad and connected it to the room's display system. New images appeared, showing the hegemony soldiers as they moved through New Haven Colony. Look at their body language, Sarah instructed. Look at how they move, how they interact with each other. Harrison studied the footage carefully. The alien soldiers moved with precision and discipline, but there was something else, something in their posture that seemed almost reluctant. They don't want to be there, Sarah said, reading his expression. Oh, they followed orders. They killed everyone they were supposed to kill, but you can see it in their movements. This isn't natural behavior for them. What are you suggesting? President Martinez asked. I'm suggesting that the hegemony are mercenaries, hired guns. They're not personally invested in exterminating humanity. They're just following a contract. Minister Santos leaned back in his chair. Even if that's true, how does it help us? Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the room, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Because mercenaries have one major weakness, sir. They work for money, not ideology, and they're very concerned with profit margins. Harrison was beginning to understand. You want to make this war unprofitable for them. I want to make it so expensive that the Star Council can't afford to keep paying for it, Sarah corrected. Every hegemony ship we destroy costs them resources. Every battle they have to fight costs them time. Eventually, the math stops working out. General nodded slowly. Asymmetric warfare, hit-and-run tactics, make them bleed for every system they take. Exactly, and there's another factor we haven't discussed yet, Sarah added. The Star Council made a crucial mistake when they decided to exterminate us instead of just containing us. Which is, asked. They gave us nothing left to lose, Sarah replied coldly. A contained humanity might have eventually accepted their restrictions. A humanity facing extinction has no reason to hold back. President Martinez was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had heard. Finally, she spoke. Captain, are you proposing total war, a fight to the death? Ma'am, they already made that choice for us. The only question now is whether we're going to make them regret it. Harrison stood up, his decision made. Mr. President, I request authorization to implement Emergency Defense Protocol Omega. The protocol was something that had been developed during the darkest days of the Third World War, but never implemented. It would transform Earth's entire economy into a war machine, conscript every able-bodied citizen, and commit every resource to military production. Admiral, President Martinez said slowly, Protocol Omega assumes we're fighting for the survival of our species. We are, ma'am. She looked around the table at the faces of humanity's leaders. In their eyes, she saw fear, anger, and something else. Something that reminded her why humanity had managed to claw its way up from primitive hunter-gatherers to a civilization. Determination. Protocol Omega is authorized, she said quietly. As the meeting broke up and the leaders began making the calls that would mobilize humanity for total war, Sarah remained behind with Admiral Harrison. Sarah, Harrison said, you know what you've just set in motion. There's no going back from this. I know, sir, but I also know what I saw on New Haven. If we're going to die, we might as well take some of them with us. Harrison nodded grimly. In the distance, air raid sirens were beginning to wail across Geneva as the first emergency broadcasts went out to the global population. Humanity was going to war, and this time there would be no surrender. The war machine awakens. 6 months after New Haven, the Sol system had transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to previous generations. Where once peaceful cargo haulers had drifted between Earth and Mars, now massive battleships prowled the space lanes. Where civilian shipyards had built exploration vessels and colony ships, now they churned out destroyers and fighters around the clock. Captain Sarah stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution, watching the final preparations for humanity's first major counterattack. The ship was one of 12 new Nemesis-class heavy cruisers that had rolled off the production lines in record time. Every piece of technology, every weapons system, every inch of armor plating had been designed with one purpose in mind: killing hegemony forces as efficiently as possible. Captain, reported Commander Hayes from the tactical station, the fleet is reporting ready for jump. All ships are showing green across the board. Sarah nodded, her eyes fixed on the tactical display that showed the largest human battle fleet ever assembled. 68 ships, ranging from massive dreadnoughts to nimble corvettes. It represented nearly half of humanity's total naval strength, and they were about to risk it all on a single desperate gambit. Signal from Admiral Harrison, announced Lieutenant Park from Communications. Operation Thunderbolt is authorized. We are go for jump. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. While the hegemony forces were systematically destroying human colonies on the Outer Rim, their main supply depot at Vega Station remained lightly defended. Intelligence suggested that capturing or destroying the depot would cripple hegemony operations for months, buying humanity precious time to build more ships. What intelligence hadn't mentioned was the cost. Everyone in the fleet knew this was likely a one-way mission. The hegemony response would be swift and overwhelming, but as Sarah had told the planning committee, they had nothing left to lose. All ships, this is Retribution, Sarah broadcast on the fleet command frequency. Execute jump in 10 seconds. Remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves today. We're fighting for every human who ever lived and every human who ever will live. The stars streaked and twisted as the fleet entered hyperspace. Sarah had made this jump hundreds of times during her career, but it had never felt like this. There was a weight to it, a finality that settled in her bones. Jump complete, reported the navigation officer. We are in the Vega system, contact. The tactical display exploded with red icons as the hegemony defenses came online. 23 enemy vessels, including 2 of their massive carrier dreadnoughts. The odds were better than intelligence had predicted, but still heavily in favor of the defenders. All ships weapons free, Sarah ordered. Target the carriers first, don't let them launch their fighters. The Retribution's main guns opened up, sending streams of plasma toward the nearest hegemony vessel. Around them, the space between Vega and its outer planets lit up with weapons fire as 68 human ships threw themselves at the enemy defenses. The first few minutes of the battle went better than Sarah had dared hope. Human missiles, redesigned with hegemony countermeasures in mind, found their targets. 3 enemy destroyers died in the opening salvo, their alien hulls cracking open like rotten fruit. But then the hegemony began to adapt. Their point defense systems, initially overwhelmed by the sudden assault, began tracking human weapons more effectively. Return fire started finding its mark. Damage report, Sarah called out as the ship shuddered under alien weapons fire. Forward shields down to 60%. Hayes reported. Minor damage to Deck 7, all weapon systems operational. On the tactical display, Sarah watched as the UES Vengeance, her old ship, broke apart under concentrated fire from a hegemony carrier. 80 souls lost in an instant. She had served with some of those people for years. "Target that carrier," she ordered, her voice cold as ice. "All weapons, maximum yield." The Retribution's plasma cannons hammered the alien ship, joined by fire from 3 other human vessels. The hegemony carrier's shields flickered and failed. Secondary explosions began to ripple along its hull. But the victory was short-lived. The second carrier had managed to launch its fighter complement, and now over 100 alien fighters were swarming through the human formation. The small, agile craft were nearly impossible to hit with capital ship weapons, and they carried surprisingly powerful armaments for their size. "Launching our fighters," reported the flight control officer. "Squadron leaders report ready for engagement." Sarah watched as humanity's pilots threw themselves at the alien fighters with characteristic recklessness. The human fighters were heavier and less maneuverable than their opponents, but they made up for it with superior firepower and pilots who fought like their lives depended on it. Because they did. "Captain," Hayes called out urgently. "New contacts jumping in, hegemony reinforcements bearing 27 Mark IV, I count. Jesus, I count 46 vessels." Sarah felt her heart sink. The reinforcements included ships she had never seen before, massive things that dwarfed even the carrier dreadnoughts, and they were moving with a purpose that suggested they had been expecting this attack. "It's a trap," she realized. "They knew we were coming." The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as the hegemony reinforcements entered the battle. Human ships that had been holding their own against the original defenders found themselves caught between 2 forces. The UES Defiance exploded under concentrated fire from 6 alien vessels. The destroyer UES Courage made a desperate ramming attack on a hegemony cruiser, taking both ships out in a spectacular fireball. "Captain," Hayes said quietly, "we're losing this one. Fleet casualties are approaching 60%. Sarah stared at the tactical display, watching red icons disappear one by one as human ships died. Each one represented hundreds of lives, people who had trusted her judgment and followed her into this hell. "Ma'am," the communications officer called out, "Admiral Harrison is ordering a general retreat. All ships are to withdraw immediately." "Signal the fleet," Sarah ordered. "Begin withdrawal in sequence. Damaged ships first, then escorts, then capital ships. We cover the retreat." But as the surviving human vessels began their desperate run for the jump point, Sarah noticed something odd on her sensors. The hegemony ships were following, but not aggressively. They seemed almost cautious. "Hayes," she said, "pull up the battle damage assessment on the enemy fleet." The data that appeared made Sarah's eyes widen. Despite being outnumbered, and the human fleet had inflicted tremendous casualties on their opponents. 14 hegemony vessels destroyed, another 8 heavily damaged. For a force that was supposed to roll over human defenses like they weren't there, the aliens had paid a much higher price than expected. Captain Hayes said, reading her expression, "They're not invincible." "No," Sarah agreed, "they're not, and they know it now." The jump to hyperspace felt different this time. Instead of the crushing weight of desperation, Sarah felt something else, something she hadn't experienced since New Haven. Hope. Back in the Sol system, Admiral Harrison reviewed the battle reports with a mixture of pride and grief. Operation Thunderbolt had been a tactical failure, but it had achieved something more important than the destruction of a supply depot. 31 ships lost, he reported to the emergency session of the Global Defense Committee. Over 4,000 casualties, but we proved something today that changes everything. President Martinez looked exhausted. The past 6 months had aged her visibly as she struggled to hold human civilization together in the face of extinction. "What did we prove, Admiral?" "We proved that the hegemony can bleed," Harrison replied. "More importantly, we proved that their casualty rates in a conventional engagement are economically unsustainable." He activated a holographic display showing economic projections based on the battle data. "According to our analysis, if they continue to take losses at the rate they experience today, the Star Council will bankrupt itself trying to exterminate us." General leaned forward. "You're saying we can win a war of attrition." "I'm saying we can make them negotiate," Harrison corrected. The hegemony are mercenaries. When this contract becomes more expensive than it's worth, they'll look for a way out. Secretary shook his head. But we can't sustain losses like today either. We don't have unlimited ships. No, Harrison agreed. But we have something the hegemony doesn't. We have nothing left to lose, and we have the ability to adapt faster than they can. He called up another display, this one showing production figures from Earth's military-industrial complex. Our shipyards are now producing vessels at 3 times pre-war capacity. Our R&D divisions have developed 17 new weapon systems in the past 6 months. Most importantly, we're learning their tactics. Minister Santos raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? The hegemony fight like professionals. They're careful, methodical, efficient. They try to minimize their own casualties while completing their objectives. But they're not prepared for an enemy that doesn't care about casualties. An enemy that's willing to ram their ships, sacrifice themselves for marginal tactical gains, fight like cornered animals. President Martinez was beginning to understand. You want to weaponize our desperation. I want to turn our greatest weakness into our greatest strength, Harrison confirmed. They expect us to fight like civilized beings. Instead, we're going to fight like humans. On the edge of the Sol system, automated defense platforms were already detecting new hegemony forces massing for what was clearly intended to be the final assault on Earth itself. But this time, the aliens would find a very different opponent waiting for them. The human war machine was fully awakened now, and it was hungry for revenge. Captain Sarah stood in the observation deck of the rebuilt Retribution, watching as the latest batch of new recruits completed their accelerated training program. Kids, mostly. 18 and 19-year-olds who had volunteered to defend their home world. They had no idea what they were getting into. But then again, neither had Sarah 6 months ago. Captain, reported Lieutenant Hayes, approaching with a data pad, we've received new orders from Fleet Command. Operation Cerberus is a go. Sarah smiled as she read the mission parameters. If Operation Thunderbolt had been about proving they could hurt the hegemony, Operation Cerberus was about proving they could hurt them badly. The war was far from over, but for the first time since New Haven, Sarah believed it was winnable. Even if winning meant turning humanity into something the galaxy had never seen before. Something savage enough to make the Star Council think twice about their next genocide attempt. Something that would leave them speechless. The savage turn. Admiral Jonathan Harrison stood before the Council of Admirals in the deep bunkers beneath Geneva, his weathered face illuminated by the blue glow of tactical displays. Around him, holographic projections showed the current state of the war, and it wasn't pretty for either side. Ladies, Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of 18 months of brutal warfare. The situation has evolved beyond our original projections. The hegemony has committed over 600 vessels to the extermination campaign. We've destroyed 137 of them. Admiral, the former general who had been promoted to oversee Pacific Fleet operations, studied the numbers grimly. At what cost, Jonathan? 212 human vessels lost, approximately 43,000 military casualties, civilian casualties. Harrison paused, the number still hard to say aloud. 8.7 million. The silence in the room was deafening. 8.7 million people dead on 73 colony worlds that had been systematically destroyed by hegemony forces. Each number represented families, children, entire communities that had been wiped from existence. Admiral Sarah entered the briefing room, her uniform bearing new scars from recent combat. In the 18 months since New Haven, she had been promoted from captain to admiral, leading what had become known as the Ghost Fleet. Her ship specialized in hit-and-run attacks deep behind enemy lines. Sorry I'm late, Sarah said, taking her seat at the table. The Phantom just returned from the Altair system. I have new intelligence on hegemony operations. Harrison nodded. Report, Admiral. The good news is that our attacks on their supply lines are working. The hegemony is having serious logistics problems. Their ships are staying in combat zones longer than intended, their replacement parts are delayed, and their crew rotation schedules are falling behind. And the bad news? Asked Admiral Park, the member of the council. Sarah's expression darkened. They're adapting. The latest hegemony fleets include ships we've never seen before, dedicated anti-human designs, and they're using new tactics. She activated her personal data display, showing footage from the recent battle at Wolf 359. They've stopped trying to minimize civilian casualties. If anything, they're deliberately targeting them to break our morale. Harrison watched the footage with growing disgust. Hegemony ships bombarding refugee convoys, orbital strikes on evacuation centers, the systematic destruction of medical facilities and schools. They're trying to turn us into monsters, Harrison realized. It's working, Sarah replied bluntly. Do you want to see what Captain Squadron did to the Hegemony fleet at Procyon? Before Harrison could respond, Sarah was already playing the combat footage. The human ships, outnumbered 3-1, had launched a coordinated attack that all conventional military doctrine. They had used civilian freighters as suicide bombs, detonating them inside hegemony formations. They had rammed damaged destroyers into enemy carriers. Most shocking of all, they had deliberately targeted hegemony medical and support vessels, something that violated every law of war humanity had ever written. Effective, Admiral commented quietly. Horrifying but effective. It gets worse, Sarah continued. After the battles, crews conducted boarding actions on damaged hegemony ships. They took no prisoners. Harrison felt a chill run down his spine. You mean they executed surrendering aliens? I mean they dissected them, alive. They wanted to understand hegemony biology so they could develop more effective ways to kill them. Sent the research data to every ship in the fleet. The room fell silent again as the implications sank in. Humanity wasn't just fighting a war for survival anymore. They were becoming something else, something darker. Sir, Admiral Park spoke up hesitantly, there's something else. Reports from the outer colonies indicate that some human populations have begun adapting their settlement patterns. What do you mean? Harrison asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. They're abandoning surface installations entirely, moving underground, building their settlements like bunkers, but more concerning, they're teaching their children to fight from age 7. Combat training, weapons maintenance, tactical doctrine. Some colonies have become essentially militarized societies where every civilian is a potential soldier. Harrison rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building. The hegemony isn't just trying to exterminate us. They're trying to turn us into something the rest of the galaxy will be afraid of. And it's working, Sarah repeated. Question is, do we care? Before anyone could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. A moment later, a communications officer burst through the security door. Admiral Harrison, priority message from Deep Space Monitoring. Massive hegemony fleet detected at the edge of the Sol system. Estimated strength, over 200 vessels. Harrison was already moving toward the command center. How long until they reach Earth? 72 hours, sir. The final battle was coming. Harrison could feel it in his bones. The hegemony had committed enough force to crush Earth's defenses permanently. This would be humanity's last stand. But as he entered the command center and saw the faces of his staff, Harrison realized something had changed. There was no fear in their eyes, no panic, just a cold, calculating determination that reminded him more of predators than prey. Admiral, reported Captain Williams from the strategic planning section, we've been running scenarios for this contingency. Operation is ready for implementation. Harrison had heard rumors about, but he had hoped it would never be necessary. Remind me of the details, Captain. Total mobilization of all civilian assets. Every cargo ship, every transport, every private vessel is requisitioned for military service. We evacuate non-essential personnel to the outer asteroid belt and then turn Earth's entire infrastructure into a weapon. Casualties. Earth's surface will be uninhabitable for approximately 50 years, but we estimate we can destroy 70% of the attacking fleet. Harrison stared at the tactical projections. Would save humanity, but at the cost of their home world. The survivors would be scattered, changed, hardened by loss into something the galaxy had never seen before. There's more, sir, Williams continued. The research data from captains' interrogations has yielded something unexpected. We've identified the location of the hegemony's primary fleet base. Where? The Rigel system. Over 800 vessels, including their entire command structure. It's where they're coordinating the genocide campaign from. Admiral Sarah stepped forward. Sir, request permission to take the Ghost Fleet to Rigel. Harrison looked at her in disbelief. Sarah, that's suicide. Even with your entire fleet, you'd be outnumbered 40-1. Yes, sir, but they won't expect it. And if we time it right, we can hit them while their main force is committed to the assault on Earth. To what end? Even if you somehow succeeded, you'd never make it home. Sarah's smile was cold and terrible. Who said anything about coming home, Admiral? The point isn't to win the battle. The point is to send a message. Harrison studied her face, seeing something there that made his blood run cold. Sarah had been one of the most professional officers in the fleet, a by-the-book commander who always followed regulations and treated enemy combatants with dignity. That woman was gone. In her place stood something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. What kind of message? Harrison asked, though he was afraid of the answer. That humanity doesn't surrender, that we don't negotiate, that if they want to exterminate us, they better bring everything they have, because we'll make them pay for every dead human with 10 of their own. Admiral leaned forward. Sarah, you're talking about a terror campaign, mass murder. I'm talking about survival, Sarah replied. The hegemony wants to turn us into monsters? Fine, let's be monsters, but let's be monsters that make them regret ever hearing the word human. Harrison realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define humanity's future. He could order Sarah to stand down, preserve what remained of their civilization's moral foundation, and accept that Earth would fall in 3 days. Or he could unleash something that would ensure humanity's survival at the cost of their soul. Sir, reported the communications officer, incoming message from the approaching hegemony fleet. They're demanding unconditional surrender. Harrison read the alien transmission and felt his last reservations crumble. The hegemony commander wasn't just demanding surrender. They were demanding that humanity submit to processing. Every man, woman, and child was to be delivered to special facilities for biological study and peaceful termination. They weren't offering slavery. They weren't even offering a quick death. They were offering systematic torture followed by genocide. Admiral, Harrison said quietly, operation is authorized. Take your fleet to Rigel. Show them what monsters look like. Sarah nodded and headed toward the exit. At the doorway, she paused. Sir, when this is over, whatever's left of humanity won't be the same species that started this war. I know, Harrison replied, but at least there will be something left. As Sarah left to prepare her fleet for what would certainly be their final mission, Harrison turned back to the tactical displays. In 72 hours, the Sol system would become a graveyard. But he was beginning to suspect that when the smoke cleared, humanity would have evolved into something the galaxy had never seen before. Something that would make the Star Council's genocide attempt look like a minor skirmish in comparison. Something that would leave their enemies speechless with terror. Outside, the first evacuation transports were already lifting off from Earth's surface, carrying refugees toward the asteroid belt. Soon, Earth would be empty except for the volunteers who had chosen to stay behind and turn their home world into humanity's final weapon. The war was ending, but Harrison had the distinct feeling that what came next would be much, much worse. Speechless. The Star Council chamber on Nexus Prime had stood for over 3,000 years, hosting the galaxy's most important diplomatic meetings in its crystal-domed halls. Representatives from 400 species had gathered here to debate trade agreements, settle territorial disputes, and maintain the peace that had endured for. Today, for the first time in its history, the chamber was silent. Prime Archon of the Confederation stood at the central podium, his normally immaculate robes wrinkled from days without sleep. Around him, the assembled representatives sat in stunned disbelief as the reports from the Sol system continued to stream in. The final casualty reports are now confirmed, announced, his voice barely above a whisper. The hegemony enforcement fleet, consisting of 217 vessels, has been completely destroyed. No survivors. A ripple of shock went through the assembled delegates. The hegemony had been the Council's enforcement arm for over 5 centuries. Their fleets had a dozen rebellious species without suffering significant losses. The idea that they could be wiped out completely was incomprehensible. How? Asked Council member of the Vegan Confederacy. Our intelligence reports indicated that the humans had fewer than 30 vessels remaining in their so-called ghost fleet. Activated the chamber's central display, showing reconstructed footage from the battle at Rigel. What they saw every convention of civilized warfare they had ever known. Human ships, many obviously damaged and held together by improvised repairs, had jumped directly into the heart of the hegemony fleet base. But instead of engaging in conventional combat, they had done something unprecedented. They had turned themselves into weapons. The human fleet commander, identified as Admiral Sarah, appears to have loaded her ships with antimatter charges, explained, his voice hollow. Rather than fighting a traditional engagement, the humans performed coordinated ramming attacks on critical hegemony infrastructure. The footage showed the results in horrifying detail. Human destroyers slamming into hegemony command ships at near-light speed, cruisers detonating their reactors inside enemy formations, fighters loaded with nuclear warheads diving kamikaze-style into the hegemony's orbital shipyards. Barbaric, muttered council member of the Alliance, completely outside the accepted parameters of warfare. It gets worse, continued. He activated another display, this one showing intercepts from human communications during the battle. The translation software rendered the human words in Galactic Standard, but the meaning was clear enough. For New Haven, for every child you murdered, for every innocent you tortured, we are the nightmare you created. The chamber stirred uneasily as the implications sank in. This wasn't military action. This was vengeance in its most savage form. Archon, called out counselor of the Silicon Confederacy, what of the reports from Earth itself? Our monitoring stations detected massive energy discharges throughout the Sol system. Wished he could avoid answering that question. The reports from Earth were somehow worse than the massacre at Rigel. When the main hegemony fleet reached Earth, they encountered what human military doctrine apparently calls environmental warfare, explained. The humans had weaponized their entire star system. The tactical display shifted to show the Sol system, but it bore no resemblance to the charts in Council files. Asteroid fields had been seeded with nuclear mines. Jupiter's moons had been converted into massive missile platforms. Mars itself had been turned into a giant, using the planet's magnetic field to launch projectiles at relativistic speeds. The humans evacuated Earth's surface and then paused, still struggling to believe what he was about to say. They detonated their planet's crust. The entire surface became a molten sea, releasing energy equivalent to several thousand antimatter warheads. Counselor leaned forward in disbelief. They destroyed their own. Not destroyed, weaponized. The energy release was directed by a network of orbital mirrors. Every hegemony ship that entered the inner system was targeted by focused solar plasma. None survived. The footage spoke for itself. Hegemony vessels, among the most advanced in the galaxy, simply vaporizing as concentrated stellar fire washed over them. Ships that had taken years to build and outfit were destroyed in seconds by an enemy that had turned their own star into a weapon. Madness, whispered council member of the Procyon Trade Federation. Complete madness. What species would sacrifice their own for tactical advantage? Apparently, replied humans. But the reports weren't finished. The chamber's display activated again, showing intelligence from across human space. What they revealed painted a picture that would haunt the Council for generations to come. Humanity hadn't just won the war, they had evolved. The scattered survivors of the human colonies had done more than adapt to constant warfare. They had embraced it. Children who had grown up during the genocide campaign were now adults, and they knew nothing but conflict. Entire generations had been raised in underground bunkers, taught that the universe was hostile and that survival required absolute ruthlessness. Our deep space monitoring networks have detected new human activities throughout their former territory, reported. They're not rebuilding their colonies, they're building something else entirely. The tactical display showed reconnaissance images of what had once been peaceful human settlements. In their place stood fortress worlds, entire planets converted into military installations. Populations that had numbered in the millions before the war had been replaced by garrison forces that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. War machines, Counselor observed quietly. They've turned themselves into a military civilization. With a difference, added grimly. Traditional military civilizations are concerned with conquest, with expanding their territory. The humans appear to have no interest in expansion. Their entire focus is on developing increasingly sophisticated ways to kill their enemies. The intelligence reports painted a picture of a species that had fundamental transformation. Human research facilities were no longer developing faster-than-light drives or terraforming technology. Instead, they were perfecting biological weapons designed to target specific alien species. They were building ships that could function as mobile weapons platforms rather than transportation vehicles. Most disturbing of all, they were developing what appeared to be planet-killing technologies that could sterilize entire worlds from orbit. Council members said, his voice carrying a weight of dread, "We have received a communication from the human government, or what remains of it." The chamber fell completely silent as the message played. The voice belonged to Admiral Jonathan Harrison, but it bore little resemblance to the diplomatic communications the Council had received from humanity in the past. To the Star Council and all member species, you wanted to genocide us, you failed, now you will learn what we have become. We are no longer the species that asked for your acceptance. We are no longer interested in joining your galactic community. We have evolved beyond the need for your approval. You created us. You turned us from explorers into warriors, from builders into destroyers, from a species that sought peace into one that has mastered war. We do not seek your territory, we do not want your resources, we want something much simpler. We want you to remember what you did to us, and we want you to live in fear of what we have become. Any species that approaches human space will be destroyed. Any vessel that threatens human interests will be eliminated. Any attempt to interfere with human affairs will result in retaliation that you cannot imagine. You tried to eliminate us because you thought we were dangerous. You were right. But you failed to eliminate us, and now we are something far worse than you ever imagined. We are the nightmare you created, and we are patient. End transmission. The silence that followed the message was absolute. For the first time the Star Council had encountered something they had no framework for understanding. Humanity had become something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that had survived attempted genocide and emerged stronger, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. Counselors said finally, "We need to discuss our options." But as he looked around the chamber, he realized that there were no options. Humanity controlled space that the Council couldn't approach. They possessed technology that could destroy planets. Most importantly, they had demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice anything, including their own lives, and to achieve their objectives. Archon Counselor asked hesitantly, "What do you recommend?" Was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. Finally, he spoke. "I recommend that we do exactly what the humans have asked us to do. Remember and fear." "You're suggesting we simply avoid human space indefinitely." "I'm suggesting that we treat humanity as we would any other natural disaster," replied. "Storms cannot be reasoned with, quasars cannot be negotiated with, and humans, as they now exist, cannot be dealt with through conventional diplomacy." The chamber erupted in discussion as delegates debated the implications. Some called for a massive military buildup to contain the human threat. Others suggested attempting to make peace while they still could. But had seen the footage from Rigel and Earth. He had read the intelligence reports about humanity's transformation. He knew that the species the Council had tried to exterminate no longer existed. In its place was something that every assumption about civilized behavior. Something that had learned to turn suffering into strength, defeat into victory, and genocide into rebirth. Something that had left the Star Council, for the first time in its 3,000-year history, completely speechless. As the debate continued around him, couldn't shake the feeling that the Council had made the greatest mistake in galactic history. They had tried to eliminate humanity because they feared what the species might become. Instead, they had ensured that humanity became exactly what they had feared most. And now, looking at the tactical displays showing the expanding network of human fortress worlds, realized that the real war hadn't even begun yet. The humans were patient, they were learning, they were growing stronger. And someday, when they were ready, they would remind the galaxy of the price of genocide. The Star Council would remain speechless until that day came. And they would remain speechless long after.